The original version of this video was uploaded to Jason Verney's YouTube channel, where it and many other videos, podcasts, snippets and films can be found. That channel can be found at youtube.com/Jason Verney.
I decided that Korea was my kind of place, and the kind of place I didn't want to have to go to immigration to stay in. At that time, when you naturalized, you were expected to take a Korean-style name, not now, but then. About 1993, I met people who were making and drinking Korean tea. Traditional tea, the way of tea. And that was mainly centered on insadong, and this was the beginning of my insadong years. In poetry, you have to translate poetry as poetry, which is tricky because Korean poetry doesn't really work as English poetry does.
Perhaps I could just start with asking you how you got into Korean culture and then how you became a Korean citizen.
Well, that'll take a couple of hours.
This is the Not So Korean podcast with Jay and Tim. I am Jason Verney.
And this is Timothy Ohm.
In this podcast series, we talk to one another and sometimes with special guests about what we know about Korea,
What we don't know about Korea,
what we want to know about Korea,
and occasionally what we don't want to know about Korea.
As you probably know, and as we always say, we usually record this live in UK's Koreatown itself. That's an area in and around New Malden. Yes, that's the largest Koreatown and Korean community in Europe. But I must add a quick statement from me, Jay, before passing you over to myself, on the fly and on the move somewhere else. That being in the heart of Seoul, South Korea. And that statement is this. On my most recent visit to Seoul, I met up with this special guest on several occasions, and whilst this interview with Brother Anthony is not that long, there is a long list of subjects I could pick to focus on at a later date, and as he's kindly agreed, record an interview again. In fact, although this conversation is less than half an hour, I did find myself and Brother Anthony, also known as An Sonjae, Brother Anthony of Taizé, I did find us hanging out quite a bit during my time in Seoul. Myself and An Sonjae went for a Korean meal on more than one occasion, including one time with a third-generation Korean from Hawaii and his partner. Brother Anthony also introduced me to a beautiful cafe which has its own art gallery and some very special books there. He attended one of my special film screenings which took place in Seoul. That was of my mid-length film Reparation, and of course showed me his office space, which includes so many books on Korean subjects and or by Koreans. And of course we shared some tea, but not, may I add, makgeolli. Not on this occasion anyway, but makgeolli is another of his passions, and yet again something he is just as knowledgeable about, as he is with literature, translation, tea, Korean poetry and many aspects of Korean culture. So without further ado, I will pass you over to me and Brother Anthony, or An Sonjae, translator, scholar, writer, member of the Taizé community and naturalized Korean citizen. Well, and so much more really. But I'll pass you over to us now. Enjoy. Yeah, so here I am with An Sonjae, or better known as, actually I'll let you introduce yourself fully, Brother Anthony. How would you like people to refer to you as?
Oh, anything goes, because, well, An Sonjae is my Korean name, but I'm better known as Brother Anthony.
Yeah, or Brother Anthony of Taizé, is it?
Taizé.
Of Taizé. Yeah, we've been friends or acquaintances for sort of a decade, and Brother Anthony is a writer, a translator. Basically, from sitting here right now, I would say he's a historian. I shouldn't laugh, but we've just come from some great Korean food down the road, and we just had some lovely green tea at Brother Anthony's work space, and just wanted to sort of get a bit more information on what Brother Anthony does and what he can tell us about his past works and how he became a Korean citizen, for example. So perhaps I could just start with asking you how you got into Korean culture and then how you became a Korean citizen.
Well, that'll take a couple of hours. Because, you see, I came to Korea in 1980 with other brothers from the community, invited by Cardinal Kim, the Archbishop, Catholic Archbishop. And so we came here with no fixed project. And by chance, in 1985, I found that I had become a professor of English literature, teaching medieval and Renaissance English literature in Sogang University, the Catholic University. And that had not been on the program, but it happened. And then the next thing that happened was about 1993. I met people who were making and drinking Korean tea, traditional tea, the way of tea. And that was mainly centered on Insadong, and this was the beginning of my Insadong years, and tea drinking, and also then visiting Chirisan. And by that time, in 1990, I published already my first translations of Korean poetry, because by about 1988, I'd asked a colleague in Sogang about a poet who might be worth translating that I might translate, and she'd introduced me to Kusang. He said he's quite simple, Catholic, spiritual. So I typed out translations of Kusang and mailed them off to a little publisher in England I saw advertised in the TLS. And she said, yes. And so she published 2 or 3 of they were my first publications of translated Korean poetry. So by that time, what with poetry and teaching and tea, and not only tea, also makgeolli, I decided that Korea was my kind of place, and the kind of place I didn't want to have to go to immigration to stay in. So I applied for Korean citizenship, which I got in 1994. And at that time, when you naturalized, you were expected to take a Korean-style name, not now, but then. So Anthony, An Sonjae sounds more like a girl's name, a woman's name. But then I was translating a novel by Ko-eun at that time, which was about the character known in Korean as Sonjae. Sonjae Dongja. It's a Buddhist story, the Kandafyuha. Sonjae is a little child in India at the time of Buddha who wanders through the world, meeting people, good people, bad people, crazy people, spirits, ghosts, whatever. They all teach him something. 52 masters. So I said, well, An Sonjae. Yes! So that's how it became Sonjae Dongja, a little pilgrim. Okay. And that's how I got my name.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I was going to say as well, one thing I've noticed since talking to you here, obviously we've met a few times before, but is the fact that your brother Anthony, but you've got religion-wise, you've got an interest in all kinds of sectors, the Buddhism, which we've just been talking about, but also if you go to this link that I'm going to give you now, any listeners out there, which is Brother Anthony's website, web page, it's Anthony with an H. Yeah, Anthony with an H .sogang.ac.kr. You can actually see that he's interested and been involved with lots of stuff that's not just, as I say, religion related. It's nothing. It's from Korean history in general. Korean literature is the big thing, and I'm surrounded by absolutely. I don't know how many books are here, but I'm surrounded by mountains of books. When I say mountains, they are tidy, very tidy, but they're just there's so many, and some of them are very rare. And one thing that Brother Anthony was just talking to me about was certain. Well, he was talking to me about what was the name of that woman? One we've just been talking about. Grigsby. Now, fascinating story, but not only that, there was this James Gale, and I didn't realise this, but he was the only translator from Korean to English. Foreign translator, sorry. Up to 1970 or the 70s, and that was very interesting to find out. I've got a few acquaintances and friends who are translators, but that was an interesting thing. But I'll put this back to you and just ask about James Gale. How did your interest in that come up, or was it a necessity because somebody asked you to, or was it a part of your job because you were doing translating?
No, sometime whenever it was, I became a member of the RAS, Royal Asiatic Society Korea, and on the council, and then I was interested in the history of the RAS. The RAS, you see, was founded in 1900. It's by far the oldest organization in Korea, virtually. And obviously you've got Yonsei and Ewha University, but they were different. Anyway, so Gale was the person who gave the first paper, we're going to say now lecture, to the RAS in the autumn of 1900. And then he was followed by Homer Hulbert. And James Gale's paper was Korean culture is essentially Chinese. And Hulbert's paper was Korean culture is essentially different. So Gale was a translator, but at a time when translation was not so popular and Korea was certainly not so known, he was very lucky. He got publishers in London to publish 2 of his books, translation, the Korean Folk Tales and the Cloud Dream of the Nine.
Oh, yeah.
Which is very unusual. I'm not sure how he did that. But then everybody knows that there were piles of other translations, unpublished, accumulated in the Toronto University Library. Gale was from Canada. And then at some point, about 15 years ago, not sure, maybe 15 years ago, there was a celebration of the 150th anniversary of Gale's birth in the church where he had been the first pastor over in Jonooga. And there I met Gale's 2 granddaughters, Wendy and Rosemary, who had come for the occasion. Because Gale, when he retired from Korea in 1926-7, he went not to Canada, he went to Bath in England. Partly his wife was British. Well, her father was a British businessman in Japan. So anyway, they went back to Bath with Gale's youngest daughter, who was still a child. And Gale then lived in Bath for several years and died, 1937. And then his daughter grew up in England, married, stayed in England, and these 2 lovely ladies are her daughters. the granddaughters of James Gale, so I'm sort of part of the family.
Yeah, you were talking about how you know them very well, and you're good friends, or family, as you say. You just mentioned a book. What was the Cloud one? Cloud Dream of the Nine. And I'm looking, as I sit here now, I'm looking at one's Quaint Korea by Louise Jordan Milne. Is that? Korea and Her Neighbours. But there's some really fascinating titles here. But as well as translating books, Brother Anthony has also written books. He's written books on tea. He's written books on foreigners in Korea. Is that one of the subjects, or is it? No, it's all right. I did some research earlier.
I thought there's an anthology of the early visitors to Korea, the explorers or people who by chance landed on a Korean island before the opening. And of course they weren't allowed in at all, so brief encounters, brief because they just came and went. But then they went back to England, published books in which they described what they saw, or heard, or didn't hear because they didn't have an interpreter. There's that, and Korean tea, and most recently I've been translating now. Last year I translated the letters of the first Korean Catholic priest, Andrew Kim Dae-gon, who studied in Macau. He was sent to study in Macau with a couple of other Koreans. Came back to Korea and was caught and killed, martyred in 1846. So translated the letters he wrote in Latin to the priest, the French priest he'd known in Macau. And now this year I've been translating the letters written by his companion, Thomas Choi, who came back to Korea a bit later in 1851, and he wasn't caught, he wasn't martyred, he served as a priest in Korea for 10 years and died of exhaustion. But his letters, in a way, are more interesting because he had all that time in Korea. Kim Dae-gon writes almost nothing about the church in Korea. He didn't have time.
Right. And you were telling me earlier about a series of, well, not a series, but some novels that you're translating for somebody, but you keep getting new novels to be by the same author, it's by, someone...
Some are by different authors. By different authors. I have an agent in New York.
Sorry. But I was just going to ask, because we know that you've translated poems by Koan, who's been to London once or twice, and he's obviously poetry is very different from. Well, I'm saying it's very different, but I'm not a translator. But it's very different from translating a novel or perhaps a factual book, a factual subject. So, what would you say are the most difficult or the biggest differences between when you're translating poetry compared to when you're translating a novel or something of fact?
Well, I don't really do fact.
That's fair enough. So novels or
poetry, you have to translate poetry as poetry, which is tricky because Korean poetry doesn't really work as English poetry does. Well, you can make it. It's all blank verse anyway, so you don't have to worry about rhyme or anything, iambic pentameter. But you have to make it sound somehow poetic. But, of course, the Korean word order and the English word order are totally different, and grammar totally different. And what Koreans write about in their poetry is not necessarily the same kind of thing or written in the same kind of way as, say, modern English poetry. So I do what I can, what we all do. But translating poetry is not a money-earning thing because nobody reads poetry these days, especially not in translation.
Well, I am gonna read some of the poems or all of the poems ultimately that you've given me a book, which is a book of poems that you translated most of, I think, of koans. But I will say as well, touching on Ko-won again, when we saw him in London, I saw him in London several years ago, and although I don't understand fully Korean, he's got this way of telling it beautifully and almost dramatically. He's very sort of charismatic, as are you, as I have to say, Brother Anthony. But I just wanted to maybe just leave just maybe one or two more questions, just not so much about what you do, but your time in Korea, perhaps where you've lived, and maybe what changes you've seen, not necessarily with the landscape, but perhaps in the culture itself, or just maybe just where you've where you lived and where you live now. We're currently in Sinchon area where you're working.
Yeah, well, that's because the Sinchon is the university area with Sogang, Yande, Ide, Hongdae. Our house is in Hwagokdong, across the river down toward Gimpo. Mm-hmm. And we've always lived there. It's lent to us. It's lent to us by the Catholic Church when we arrived, and it's still there. Well, we've repaired it and kept it waterproof and so, but that's where I live. So I commute to my office. Yeah. I live with 3-4 other brothers. We have prayer together, a community life, but then each of us has work or ministry. So that's how I spend my time.
Yeah, and one last thing, you're based in Seoul, but do you get to visit these days? I mean, I'm sure in the past, and you're a busy man, but do you get to visit other parts of Korea at all these days, or just a little bit?
Oh, yeah, well, during the pandemic, you get a bit stuck just coming and going to the office. So I have a friend who's a professor in university down near Busan. So I've been going down there quite often, maybe once a month almost, and he drives, and we've been visiting, we visited temples, potters, and then in the springtime we go to Chirisan for the tea and the cherry blossom and the plum blossom. Oh, yeah. So that he gets me out of my rut, yes.
Yeah, oh, very nice. Well, I think we'll leave it there. It's been really nice talking to you. Perhaps once I've picked a subject from your array of knowledge from your website and elsewhere, maybe we can at a later date meet and speak about a particular subject. Because I know you're happy to talk at length about certain subjects. So thank you very much, Brother Anthony. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode. So that's all from us. 안녕히 계세요.